Well, I want to thank the Vintage Baseball Association for this invitation, Gary. I don't know if you're primarily responsible for that or whoever, but I think I was around for the first organizational meeting of this organization 25 years ago back in Columbus. Jim Tootle would probably remember that better than I. Uh, uh, but I know there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm about trying to create a new national organization. And now 25 years later, there's a couple hundred members, and the organization has been strong all these years and providing such really valuable information. And so it's good to see a lot of guys here at this virtual conference, and a few people that I recognize and from the Muffin days or whatever. David Bowman, I just want to say, if you are not an umpire, I certainly hope that you are considering it. With that look, I would definitely pay to see that match. Jim Tootle back on. Jim and I played together for a number of years. He never got a hit off of me. Jim was never got a hit off of me, but it's good to see the Muffins guys here a little bit too. Let me start with a little story. For a number of years, I've been hosting a highlight on the Reds radio network on the pregame show, a highlight from Reds history. And thank you, Jim. Over the years, a lot of different stories. I'll just tell you one quick one here. It has nothing to do with vintage baseball, but it's one of my favorite stories about the Reds. They had a young pitcher who came up at the club in the mid-30s by the name of Gene Schott. No relation to Marge. That's a whole nother different set of highlights. But when young Gene joined the club in the mid-30s, the Reds were not a very good team. And sure enough, in one of his very early starts, he got knocked around, got the loss. And after the game was over, the radio announcer was giving the summary of the game. Today's game, the Reds were defeated 6-2. The winning pitcher was Dean. The losing pitcher was Schott. And as you can imagine, that did catch the attention of many of the listeners. A few who called in very kindly to ask about the condition of the young man. A few others who called in to say that Mr. Crosley, Powell Crosley, owner of the Reds, really didn't have enough pitchers to start shooting them all every time they lost a game. And of course, there were a few cynics who called in with some suggestions for other names that could be added to the list. Anyway, that ended the shorthand, and for Mr. Schott, and afterwards, the losing pitcher was Gene Schott. Only in Cincinnati. He's the only Schott ever to play for a Major League Baseball team. Well, nobody was Schott on the 1869 Red Stockings, but I've included a number of highlights from that season over the years, from the customs and rules of the day, like the time Harry Wright was called out by spectators at a game in Philadelphia when the umpire asked the crowd to help him out on a call on a foul tip. Many nicknames for the clubs over the years. You know, we know them as the Cincinnati Red Stockings from 1869, but they were also at the time, some of the newspapers referred to them as the red-legged ball tossers. And my favorite, the Knights of the Crimson Hose. I'm hoping the Reds revive that one soon, the Knights of the Crimson Hose. And stories about their month-long road trip to California in the fall of 1869 on the just completed Transcontinental Railroad. Club finances are always an interesting topic, a payroll of about $10,000 in 1869. And the time they scored 108 runs in one game, the highest score they ever made. But what I wanted to go over today was the highlights from that 1869 season that were highlights, but almost were lowlights. They almost ended up, the Red Stockings almost ended up losing a few games that year. And we often think of them as this, in this club that never lost, and this club that was never threatened, an invincible juggernaut. But in fact, they had some close calls, and I wanted to go over some of that today. Now, as Greg Gay just mentioned earlier, that team is definitely worth looking at in terms of its if it's historical significance, they were in the vanguard of professional baseball, one of the very first, if not the first openly all professional club. Secondly, they pioneered the new uniform style with the knicker-length pants. They were the first team to have, for other clubs to start copying that uniform style. And it really remained the dominant uniform style for over a century now. I mean, there's still some guys that wear the short pants, but most of the guys wearing long pants now. But that was the uniform style for almost 100 years. And finally, they were the first team to play on both coasts in the same season, from New York to Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. to Chicago and Milwaukee and Omaha and Quincy, Illinois, and all the way to San Francisco, carrying the gospel of the new national pastime from coast to coast. The Red Stockings would be remembered today for all of these things, but at the time, those first barely caused a ripple in the press. The single most important feature driving interest in the club back then was the fact that they were undefeated. As the season wore on, the Red Stockings vanquished all their opponents, averaging 42 runs a game. The press, the baseball public became fascinated with this juggernaut. They drew huge crowds. Crowds of 10 to 15,000 were enormous at the time, and the press often called the throngs the biggest crowd ever to see a match in Philadelphia or Chicago, or you can fill in the blank. But had this team not been undefeated, had they lost along the way in their 57-game season, I don't believe they would have held the spotlight as they did all year long. And while they would still deserve credit for their other innovations, I'm not sure they would hold the status they do as the team that made baseball famous. Their 57-0 record is in the history books, and it seems as though they were never challenged. But like every great team, the Red Stockings had their challenges, and every time they managed a victory. 4 times that victory string was in doubt. 4 times the club came very close to losing or tying a game, and no doubt a loss would have jeopardized their significant role in baseball's story. The first close call came on June 15th, and Greg Gay just referenced this game a little bit earlier in his presentation. On June 15th, 1869, the Red Stockings, having won their first 14 games, played in New York against the mighty New York Mutuals, the champions of 1868. And in an era of high-scoring slugfest, this game was remarkable for its low scoring, the final score 4-2. By the way, the illustration, the woodcut there is of the Union grounds in Brooklyn. The Red Stockings scored 2 runs early and whitewashed the Mutuals for 7 innings, practically unheard of at the time. But the Mutuals scored 1 run in the 8th and 1 in the top of the 9th. And they may very well have taken the lead, but not for a brilliant defensive maneuver by the Red Stockings third baseman, Fred Waterman. With 1 out and runners on first and second, the Mutual batter hit a pop-up to Waterman. Of course, there's no infield fly rule, and Waterman let the ball drop in front of him, tossed quickly to shortstop George Wright, who had quickly covered third base for a force out at third, and then right through to second base for another force and a double play. Here's the way it was described in a Cincinnati paper. R. Hunt, who on the Mutuals, they're batting here, and this is the 9th inning. R. Hunt made his first, was sent to a second by Swandell, and then home by C. Mills. Swandell getting meantime to his second, and C. Mills to his first. Then came the best play of the day, calling forth tremendous cheers from the excited throng. Egler took the bat immediately after Mills and sent a little fly to Waterman at third, which was purposely dropped, thus throwing off their guard both Swandell and Mills. Obviously meaning they stayed close to their bases. Swandell then, in attempting to make his third, was put out by George Wright, who had gotten into Waterman's place, and then the ball was fielded to Swayze at second, and C. Mills, who was trying to make that base, was a goner. So of the 3 Mutual men who were so lately decorating the bases, only 1 was left. Of course, they did. That sent the game into the bottom of the 9th, and in the custom of the day, the Red Stockings were batting last. They had won the toss and chosen to bat last, and they scored on. I mean, the game kind of had an anticlimactic ending. The Reds scored on a muff. A bad throw to first allowed a Red Stocking batter to come all the way to third, and he scored moments later on a wild pitch. So that was the winning run. But as in the custom of the day, the rules of the day, they continued batting and scored one more run before the inning was finally over. And so the final score was 4-2. This was the way the local newspapers covered it in Cincinnati. It was a close call, but an even more dramatic comeback was required on July 24th. This game was against the Forest Cities of Rockford, Illinois, playing in Cincinnati. And this woodcut is the only illustration that we have of the Union grounds in Cincinnati, with a little wooden grandstand behind home plate and the bleachers down the first and third base side. The star pitcher on the Forest City team was Albert Spalding of Sporting Goods Empire fame. But in 1869, he was just recognized as a very, very good young pitcher. The Red Stockings had defeated the Forest Cities earlier in the season, but this Rockford club was one of the top teams in the West, along with Cincinnati. The game was in Cincinnati, and the Red Stockings winning streak was at 29. The Red Stockings led 12-9 going into the top of the eighth when Forest City scored 5 runs for a 14-12 lead. The score stood till the bottom of the ninth, and for the first time, the Red Stockings came to bat in the ninth inning trailing. With 1 out, Harry Wright singled, and the next batter, Andy Leonard, singled, sending Harry to third. The Red Stockings then executed a double steal that Harry called from third base, Wright scoring to narrow the lead with 1-run run. So with Andy Leonard on second, a wild pitch allowed him to score. Must have been quite the wild pitch to let him score from second base, and that tied the game. The next hitter, pitcher Asa Brainerd, then doubled. The excitement at the ballpark was enormous, and the newspaper reporters seemed to get caught up in it because they failed to agree on what happened. One paper claimed the next hitter, Charlie Swayze, singled to drive in Asa with the winning run, and another report had Brainerd scoring on a passed ball. Even the Red Stockings scorebook was inconclusive. And here is one account. Start here in the middle in the Red Stockings account. Leonard came home on a pass ball. Brainerd went to second on a splendid grounder to the left, then came home the winner of the game on a short hit past Barnes. Obviously, this account had him scoring on a hit. But as I said, it was not clear. But however they did it, the Red Stockings had won their 30th in a row by just 1 run, the prettiest match ever witnessed in Cincinnati, a hotly contested game. Now, the scores against the Mutuals and the Forest Cities were not too surprising, given that both teams were among the elite clubs of the day. But the next close call caught everyone by surprise. On August 5th, again in Cincinnati, the Red Stockings hosted Central Cities of Syracuse. This was a second-tier team, and I hope nobody here is from Syracuse and will take offense, but this was not an elite club. Think of a major league team today playing a top college club, let's say. In fact, the Red Stockings had defeated them the day before in Cincinnati, 37-9. There was so little interest in the game of August 5th that only a couple of hundred people showed up for the game. Unfortunately, the Red Stockings didn't show up either. Regular pitcher Asa Brainerd was apparently soused or hung over, and Captain Harry Wright refused to play him. With Brainerd on the bench, Harry called on a sub from the Red Stockings junior 9, and then catcher Doug Allison refused to catch, complaining of sore hands. Well, without another substitute available, Harry started Allison in the outfield, and he shuffled his lineup to cover all of the holes. The team wound up with 5 players playing out of their regular positions, and it quickly showed, the club making several muffs in the early innings. And the Central Cities played extremely well, and amazingly, the score stood 22-22 after 7 innings. Finally, in the top of the 8th, the Red Stockings came alive, scoring 13 times before any outs. The game no longer seemed in doubt, but the Central Cities began stalling, their pitcher pausing between pitches, and throwing many out of the strike zone. Why? Because the rules of the day said that if a game ended before a full inning was completed, the score reverted back to the score at the end of the previous inning. This game had started at the usual time of 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon, and by now it was past 6 o'clock, likely a cloudy day with a lot of smoke in the air, very common in the city of Cincinnati. And if Central City could stall long enough for the game to be called because of darkness, the score would revert back to the seventh inning and the 22-22 tie. At this point, Harry Wright came to bat. And Harry, a model of integrity, recognized by all for his sportsmanship and his gentlemanly behavior, struck out. The Syracuse team immediately suspected Harry had struck out on purpose to hurry up the inning, and maybe they were right. In 1869, the Red Stockings struck out as a team only 8 times. And for those of you who tire of all the strikeouts in today's year, think about that. In 1869, the Red Stockings struck out as a team only 8 times. And this was the only time all season long Harry Wright struck out. The Syracuse team then left the field, and the umpire, after complaining to the umpire about Harry striking out on purpose, and the umpire, after waiting required 5 minutes, declared the game over, and the Red Stockings the winner 36-22. Harry did not appear at the press conference after the game. The winning streak was now 35 games. And the final close call came a couple of weeks later, with the winning streak now at 39. And this final close call came against the Haymakers of Troy, New York, in Cincinnati again at Union Grounds. The Haymakers were a powerhouse club and were out to revenge an earlier loss to the Red Stockings 38-31 back in June, when the Red Stockings were on their famous East Coast trip. The Haymakers were widely considered to be a notorious club, often suspected of playing under the influence of gamblers who seemed to have very close connections with club officials and players. This game was very heavily promoted in the press leading up to the game. And here you can see an ad that the baseball club ran, Haymakers versus Red Stockings. And if you go down a few lines, you'll see plenty of seats reserved for ladies. Gates open at 1 o'clock. Again, this would have been a 3 or 3:30 start. Extra street cars at the same hour. So the ballpark in Cincinnati was on the edge of downtown, about a mile or mile and a half from the central city. So you could walk to it, or you could take one of the many streetcars to get to the game. The Red Stockings, so there were over 10,000 people estimated at the grounds, which was a huge crowd in Cincinnati at that time, far exceeding the seating capacity of that little ballpark. So there would have been people standing in droves down the foul lines and perhaps even into the outfield. The Red Stockings fell behind early, spotting the Haymakers a 6-run lead. But by the 5th, the score stood at 17-17, and the Red Stockings' reputation for scoring heavily in the later stages of games suggested the Cincinnati boys would soon pull ahead. There were rumors Haymaker backers had as much as $15,000 bet on the game, a huge amount for that time. And when things started to look bleak for the Haymakers, the game took a strange turn. Now, this is the account of the game in the 5th inning, the top of the 5th. The Red Stockings were batting first in this game, even though they were at home. So here is Cal McVeigh, the Reds right fielder, led off the inning. And here the account there reads, the score is now even, being 17 on a side. The Cincinnati's go in for their heaviest batting inning, the 6th. Evidently, at some point, somebody had calculated they scored more of their runs in the 6th inning than any other. Anyway, McVeigh goes to the bat and he tips a foul ball, which bounds 3 times. Craver, the Haymaker catcher, grasps a handful of gravel instead of the ball, and then quickly picks up the ball and, holding it at arm's length, calls for a decision. The umpire decides the striker not out. Craver angrily throws a ball with all his might to Fisher. There was some hissing from the crowd. They were confused about what had happened. And actually, in fact, so were the newspapers. This account says the ball bounced 3 times, but there was another Cincinnati account that agreed with the haymaker catcher and said no, it had only bounced once. Well, this confusion certainly and controversy generated an extraordinary amount of discussion. Haymaker club officials came out to argue. The haymaker players came out to argue and stand around the umpire. And at some point, not getting any satisfaction, the haymaker owner, the president of their club, I should say, ordered the team off the field. And the Red Stockings officers then went to them and asked them to remain, offered even to change umpires, but the haymakers boarded their omnibus and headed back to the hotel, trailed by dozens of Red Stockings fans cursing and yelling at the New York players. A forfeit was declared. Again, you had to wait 5 minutes. If the team didn't return to the field, it was a forfeit. The umpire declared it a forfeit, ruled the Red Stockings the winners. And although the decision was appealed to the national ruling body of the day, the Red Stockings remained the victors, their winning streak intact. As it turned out, that was the last of the close calls the Cincinnati Nine had. They won another 17 games and finished the season 57-0 and forged a hallowed place in baseball history. Well, let me stop there. We've got a few minutes here for questions. So if anybody has a couple of questions, I'd be happy to answer that, discuss that, or whatever. Well, I may have got a frozen screen here. I'm not sure. Okay, here we go.
Okay. Craig,
yeah, somebody started a question.
Greg?
Yes.
Yeah, did we have any statistics on the Red Stockings profitability or lack thereof in 1869 and 1870?
They didn't have profitable years either year. There's a widely reported number. I think they lost $1.65 or something in 1869. I mean, they had enormous crowds, typically at probably 25 cents, sometimes 10 cents a game. The Red Stockings took at least a half of the gate share typically, or they would have taken a normal share of the gate receipts, which I say normal, it wasn't all that normal yet for two teams to be playing that would share gate receipts. But they had terrific expenses with the train trips, the two really long trips, one to the East Coast, and they took a couple trips through the Midwest, and then of course their long California trip, which was that was almost an all expense paid trip because the California promoters wanted to bring them out there to play. But they didn't make much money on that, and with their expenses, they didn't clear it much. And then in 1870, again, Greg Gages, if you really heard Greg's presentation earlier, the Red Stockings added to their ballpark. They added a new grandstand that cost several $1,000s. And by the end of the season, they definitely had not made money in 1870. So those 2 years when they had pumped a lot of money into the club, they were carrying debt before the 1869 season. They still had that debt on their books. And that was one of the reasons. And with the success of the Red Stockings in 1870, in 69 and 70, and with no reserve clause, the clubs are just, they signed guys to 1-year contracts, which a lot of the guys didn't honor anyway. Players would jump contracts, or certainly they were all available to be signed the next season. It's like having a club all full of free agents. And so the bidding for the players had gone up significantly, and the Cincinnati club didn't feel like they could maintain the club in 1870 without having to spend even more money, and they couldn't quite figure out how they were going to make any. So
the tortilla, we got it.
That's what they gave it up. But anyway, it was just from a revenue balance, an ongoing cost and expense balance, it did not work.
Hey, Greg, this is
They
Corky.
started out in the hole was a really big thing because they had spent a lot of money in 1867 and 1868, particularly on the grounds. And,
Yes, on
and they were
building their,
paying some of the players in 1868.
yeah. Corky?
Yeah, when I was doing research on the making of 19th century baseball, I ran into a couple inferences, if you will, that George Ellard made a ball specifically for the Red Stockings that was a little less lively so they could focus on their defense instead of chasing a bouncy ball all over the place. Do you ever run across that type of information in your research?
Well, I know that balls differ because, you know, as somebody mentioned on an earlier presentation, you typically just played the game with one ball, and we all know that. In the Red Stockings case, a lot of times the ball was not used in later games because the ball was treated as a trophy ball at the end of the game. The score was written on the ball and was kept in a Red Stockings trophy case. That supposedly that group of baseballs came up for auction about 15, 20 years ago, and it was proved to be a fake. Cooperstown has a couple of those trophy balls from the 1870 season that were Red Stocking games. But yes, there, you know, only one ball used. And before the game, that was a debate a lot of times. The Red Stockings would bring their Ellard balls with them from Cincinnati. George Ellard, the proprietor of a sporting goods store in Cincinnati, he made the baseballs, sold a lot of baseball equipment. And the Red Stockings liked that ball, and they would offer that for use in the game. And sometimes they were successful in getting it used. Sometimes they had to play with the other club's ball. But so I do know, I mean, there definitely were differences in baseballs, and it would have made sense. I had not seen that particular fact about that it was the other ball was made softer, but they were an extraordinarily good fielding club. They were also a very good hitting club too. I'm not sure which would have benefited them the most, but whatever the case, they had their favorite baseball, yes. It's been a very enjoyable conference. I just wanted to say to Gary and the guys who put it together, it's been a really good group of speakers. I've really enjoyed it. And again, appreciate the invitation, and happy to see some new faces. I've kind of dropped off of the umpiring thing. I'm not doing that anymore. But I will be umpiring a match here in about 2 weeks, right at the end of April. The Cincinnati Red Stockings and I think the Cincinnati Buckeyes are celebrating their 20th season this year, and they're having a reunion game. They're bringing back a lot of their old players and playing a reunion game, and I'm going to go umpire that. But I'm going to have to brush up on the rules like Al was talking about. I haven't umpired a game in a decade probably. So anyway, that'll be fun. Bob, you're muted.
Yeah, how's that? Thank you so much, Greg. A great program. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I have to talk to you sometime about that guy on the Forest City, Cheney, who was a real rapscallion and played against the Red Legs. So anyway.
Yeah, there were a lot of those.
Yeah. We'll bring on Tom Derry now.